Today's lecture is going to be about the very basics of bird anatomy. So think of this as a primer to all the basic concepts you need in order to become an ornithologist. Okay, so this lecture is not comprehensive. Given the time constraints, I'm not going to be covering all aspects of bird anatomy, but I am going to be covering some of the most important basics that you can find out about as you go forward with this course. Okay, now it's important to remember birds, much like mammals, have a digestive system. They have a nervous system that functions much the same way as we do, with some important differences which you'll hear about in my lecture on color. You'll also hear about differences in their sound control system at some point during this course. And there are other important differences as well. Certain physiological systems of birds, like their water conservation system, I'm going to talk about in my next lecture on physiology. But today I'm just going to talk about the most important ways in which birds differ from mammalian physiological systems that all of you will be familiar with from school and college curricula. And with that in mind, we're just going to give you a basic overview of the demands that drive changes in anatomy of a bird and how we study them. All right? So with that in mind, let me begin my lecture by asking a simple question. How do you study bird anatomy? All right? Now, that is a very important question. And that is something that has been a classic part of ornithology for well over 200 years. Remember that. And in those days, you didn't study anatomy from photographs. In fact, you still cannot study anatomy from photographs. And that is where museum specimens come in very handy. So people used to go out to the field and collect specimens. They still do. And if you want to study the skeletal anatomy, the skeleton of the bird, you actually put the specimen into a sort of a tank with these beetles in them. They're called dermestids, D-E-R-M-E-S-T-I-D, if anyone is interested. They're carrion-eating beetles that will eat all the flesh and leave the bones so that you have them nice and cleaned to study skeletal anatomy. If you wanted to study muscular anatomy, you stain them and dissect them. If you want to study other internal systems, you dissect the bird's digestive system or the brain, and you can study all of these questions using that. Now, in the modern day, it's not always easy to get permission to collect a specimen. In fact, sometimes it's almost impossible. So can you use existing specimens and collections to study anatomy? Yes, you can. There are now more modern tools available to study anatomy. You can, for instance, put a specimen in an X-ray and take a 2D slice of the bird to see its skeleton. You can also get this information in 3D. You put the bird in a CT scanner using X-rays. You can image the entire bird and reconstruct its skeletal systems in 3 dimensions. You can also study soft tissues using CT scanning. You just have to stain them first so that they are dense to X-rays. And once they're dense to X-rays, you'll be able to see all of the skeleton that you need to see. All of the soft tissue that you need to see. And once you've gotten an understanding of bird anatomy, and you'll get reading material on this as well, the important thing to remember is that what has largely driven bird anatomy is flight and the demands of flight. Because birds evolved flight pretty early on in their evolution. And as a result of flight, many birds have dispersed throughout the world to far-flung places. They inhabit very extreme environments. And that is an important thing to remember, because even birds that have since then lost the ability to fly, like penguins or ostriches, retain several of the adaptations that enabled birds to fly in the first place. Let's talk about 2 of these in particular. One is called pneumatization. Now, I'm sure all of you know where I'm getting at, because most of you have heard that birds have air spaces and light bones. That is true. So birds have big air spaces in their bones that make them much lighter and give birds that extra, make it less work for them to be able to fly. Now, Birds that run on the ground have to be careful too, because lightweight does not mean brittle. Okay? You can't have brittle bones. You have to have lightweight bones, but with a high resistance to impact stresses. And that is a trade-off that governs how birds take to the air, how they stay in the air, and how some of them don't stay in the air when they're on the ground. Because if you have brittle bones, you can make them really, really light in order to get off the ground. But they should not become brittle, because otherwise when you run on the ground, you're going to give yourself stress fractures. And stress fractures obviously are not a good thing for the bird. So pneumatization is a trade-off between making your bones light and not making them brittle. And as long as they're light enough to get the bird off the ground, they function very well in flight. The other way birds have of making their skeleton lighter is to do away with unnecessary joints and bones that get in the way. And that they accomplish by bone fusion. So bird skeletons don't necessarily have all of the articular joints and sutures that our bones do. They are instead heavily fused. And we're going to look at some examples of that across the bird world. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the very basics of the human skeleton. So we'll describe the various aspects of the bird skeleton in order to get an understanding of how bone fusion has actually happened in this particular group of birds, group of vertebrates, the birds. All right. Now, broadly, you can call the skeleton three kinds. I'm sure you all know this. There is the cranial skeleton, there is the axial skeleton, and there is the appendicular skeleton. Okay? The appendicular skeleton is the one we'll get to last. But let's start by talking about the skull of the bird. Now, the skull of the bird is a very heavily fused and highly modified structure. If you look at the skulls of fish, reptiles, mammals, you can see sort of a steady process where you can figure out where the bones have gone. Birds, as you will know by now, are an offshoot of theropod reptiles. They arose from a separate stock than the one that gave rise to mammals. And the reason there's been so much confusion about the true ancestor of birds is because their skeletons are so highly modified. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the skull, where the bones have all fused to give lightweight but strong protections and strong brain cases. Right? There is still one thing that they retain. Now, as you'll know, as I'm speaking, my lower jaw is moving outwards like a hinge in order for me to produce sounds. Birds are primarily capable of one form of cranial kinesis, and that is the bill. Okay? As you will know, instead of jaws with teeth, many birds have bills. The bill is a bony structure with a keratinous covering over it. It's called the rhamphotheca, Rhamphotheca. So write that down and look it up if you're interested. There is a keratinous covering over the bill, but the bony part of the bill, the upper jaw, is fused to the skull. The lower jaw sits with a bone that's called the quadrate. Okay? Quadrate, quadrate. And the quadrate bone rotates like so. So imagine if this is the bill. Okay? I'm going to do this way. The quadrate bone rotates such that the lower jaw falls out. And that is the main form of kinesis that the bird's skull is capable of. And bills come in all shapes and sizes, right? As you very well know. You've got the avocet's bill that's up curved, you've got the curlew's bill that's down curved, you've got thick seed crushing bills, you've got nectar feeding bills, you've got insectivore bills that snap and trap insects. And in all of these cases, it's important to note that all of this is driven by the quadrate articulation. So it causes the lower jaw to drop out, and the bill can perform a diverse array of functions. Alright? It's not just the bones, obviously. There are muscle attachment points and other things that act like springs to return things to their original position. Because if they weren't there, you'd have the jaw fall out and it would never be able to get back. Okay? So you've got jaw muscles that can pull the cranium back to its original position. And that is the fundamental basis of what you need to understand about bird skulls. Moving on to the axial and appendicular skeletons, you will see that there are a number of adaptations here that also increase this lightweightedness of the skeleton and its ability to power flight. All right. Let's talk about the axial skeleton for a bit. Now, what is the axial skeleton primarily made of? The vertebrae that form the spine. They articulate with the skull here. And if you remember human vertebral columns, you've got cervical, thoracic or lumbar, you've got sacral or sacral vertebrae, and you've got the caudal or the tail vertebrae, right? Now in birds, you've got a very large number of cervical vertebrae. In some birds up to 14, and they are all independent of each other. They are all articulated. In fact, they are very flexibly articulated, which is why some birds like owls can turn their heads all the way around, all right, without breaking their neck. You and I can't do that. This is as far as I can turn my head, but owls and other birds can turn their heads all the way around. Then you've got about 5 fused thoracolumbar vertebrae, okay? Thoracic vertebrae, let's say for now, but these are fused, and the sacral vertebrae are also fused into a single bone that's called the synsacrum. Okay, the synsacrum is a fused bone which articulates with the pelvis, and the pelvis also consists of fused ilium, ischium, and pubis, all fused into one pelvic bone. So the synsacrum supports the pelvis and then articulates further down with the caudal or the tail vertebrae. And the final tail bones consists of a fused series of bones that is called the pygostyle. P-Y-G-O-S-T-Y-L-E, pygostyle. The pygostyle is the articulation point for the tail feathers and the tail muscles, and that's where most of the tail of the bird comes from, right? It arises from the pygostyle like so. And muscle articulations around these attachment points lead to birds that can move their tails as a result. But you can see there's a lot of bone fusion there as well. There's also bone fusion at the front of the rib cage, where the clavicular bones are fused into something called the furcula. F-U-R-C-U-L-A. I'll get to the furcula in a minute. Just remember, there's a lot of bone fusion going on at all of these levels. All right? And nowhere is this more apparent than in the appendicular skeleton. Now, my appendicular skeleton, at least my forelimbs, let me talk about for a minute, has a humerus, a radius and ulna, all right, carpals, metacarpals, and 5 distinct phalanges. Now, birds go the same way. They've got a humerus, they've got a radius and ulna, all right. Their carpals are all fused into a bone called the radial, never mind what it's called. But remember, there's fusion here. Then there is a carpometacarpus, a single fused structure. And instead of 5 phalanges, the phalanges are all fused into a single point. So if you look at a bird's appendicular skeleton, it looks something like this. Okay, you don't have distinct phalanges, you have fusion. And this fusion of point is where the wing feathers attach, and they attach all along this and the wing muscles. This provides lightweight yet flexible articulation points, getting rid of sort of unnecessary joints, if you will, so that the bird's wings can attach to this and flap. It is a very specialized and very highly modified limb that is used to power flight. This is very different from the wing bones of bats and other animals that have evolved powered flight. Bats, of course, retain the phalangeal digits. They've just got a membrane across them. Birds have a very skeletally modified appendicular skeleton, as you can see. And these modifications extend all the way, as I mentioned, to the clavicular bone and also to the sternum. The sternum of birds is heavily enlarged. What is the sternum? It's the bone here, the breastbone it's called. In birds, it is heavily enlarged and possesses a keel. Okay, a keel like the front of a boat. It is shaped like so, and this huge area sticks out. This is called a carina. C-A-R-I-N-A, carina. And the carina, the reason it's so big and has such a large surface area is because the flight muscles attach between the furcula and the carina, the thoracic muscles. And they are massive in birds for their body size. Why are they so big? Because they're what moves the wings. And as you know, birds' wings move with a great deal of power. And all that power is generated by the muscles. And in order for those muscles to function as efficient levers, they have to have sufficient attachment points. Now, birds like the ostrich or the emu that lose the power of flight end up having a greatly reduced carina. So people who found extinct birds can use the size of the carina to determine whether that bird was flighted or flightless. Alright? The carina relative to body size becomes very small, as do the muscles attached to it relative to body size. Like the small hummingbirds that have very powerful flight muscles have huge carinas relative to their body size. In some hummingbirds, the whole bird is that big and the carina is that big. Okay? So it can be really big to power these huge muscles. Whereas in an emu or anything that has lost the power of flight, it becomes very small and highly reduced. Okay? Now, birds also have hind limbs, right? The legs and feet. And these bones follow much the same articular pattern as our own bones do. Alright? Until you get to the toes. The toes of birds do many different things. They can face in many different ways, and you have many different classifications as a result of that. Okay? So most perching birds are what you call anisodactyl. A-N-I-S-O, dactyl, D-A-C-T-Y-L. They've got 3 toes facing in front and 1 toe facing backwards. Alright? You've also got tridactyl, 3 toes facing forward, and didactyl, 2 toes, like the ostrich, facing forward. Okay? Tri and didactyl. You've got different kinds of toes. Now, many birds are what you call isodactyl. Now, what does iso mean? They're symmetric. Aniso means they're not symmetric. You've got 3 toes in front, 1 toe at the back. Iso means that, like trogons and many other birds, you've got 2 toes in front and 2 toes at the back. Now, these need not be perfectly symmetric. You've got many different types of isodactyl feet. I'm just showing you the broadest kind here. Okay? And then you've got a very specialized kind of foot that's found in swifts and a few other birds, where all 4 toes face forward, like so. This is called pamprilodactyl. Okay? P-A-M-P-R-Y-L-O dactyl. 4 toes facing forward. Now, you don't need to remember this terminology. This is just here for your interest. And if you want to look up these terms, you can actually see what the kinds of feet and perching devices that birds have are. Okay? We might rather be more interested in you understanding how the demands of flight have led to basic concepts such as these happening and have overall affected the shape of the skeleton. So ideally, I would want you to look at a skeleton and be able to say, aha, that's what's happened here. That's what's happened here. And think about it that way. To know your way around the skeleton rather than necessarily remembering all of the specifics. Okay? And that same holds true for most of the other systems of birds. Now, many of these systems are going to be covered in bits and pieces in subsequent lectures, so I'm not going to go into details of how a basic excretory or a basic nervous system works. I am going to touch upon 2 things though, the respiratory and digestive systems of birds, because they've got some special things that are not found elsewhere. Okay? Birds have lungs, just like we do. But the lungs are only one component of their respiratory system. Above the lungs, they've actually got 2 big air sacs, the clavicular and the cervical air sac, and then they've got 2 abdominal air sacs in the posterior as well. These air sacs, you might imagine, function in buoyancy, because when they're full of air, the bird becomes more buoyant, like a swim bladder, right, in a fish. But that's not the case. Birds actually have some very interesting utilities for these air sacs. What happens is, when a bird breathes in, that same air is not expelled until 2 breaths later. Allow me to explain. When a bird breathes in, the air goes straight into the posterior air sac. Okay? When it expels its breath, this air does not come out. It actually goes into a set of tubes called parabronchi. P-A-R-A-B-R-O-N-C-H-I. Okay, parabronchi. And it stays there. Then the bird takes in another breath. When the bird takes in another breath, This air goes to the front air sacs, while the new breath goes straight into the posterior air sacs. And then the bird exhales again, and out comes this air. So the air goes posterior air sacs, parabronchi, one breathing cycle. And then on the second breathing cycle, it goes anterior air sacs and out. So there's two things. It means that the same volume of air stays inside the bird for longer, which means that the bird can absorb more oxygen out of it. Secondly, it means that the flow of air is unidirectional. So there is no tidal mixing of air, like our own lungs. For instance, in our own lungs, old air and new air mix with each breath. A bird's lung does not have that because of the air sacs. So the air doesn't mix, and you've got unidirectional airflow, which is very good for getting the extra oxygen that you need to power a demanding activity such as flight. I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail in my lecture on physiology. Birds' guts also have certain specializations that you don't see elsewhere. Now, birds like pigeons or galliform birds, chickens basically, have a pouch in the foregut called the crop. Okay? So they can eat food really quickly, store it in there, and then digest it later. They can also store food in their crop and regurgitate it for their nestlings. So they have this storage pouch, the crop, that we do not possess. Alright? And some birds actually can ferment food in the crop. So there's a bird called the Hoatzin, Hoatzin, which actually has bacteria that ferment its plant food in the foregut. There are other birds that, like us, can ferment food in the hindgut. We don't ferment food, but ruminants do. And they can actually ferment or digest food in the hindgut. Not so the Hoatzin. Birds also possess a gizzard, okay, which we do not possess. And the gizzard is full of grit that grinds up the food because birds obviously cannot chew. So this grit actually helps grind up the food and make it more processed so that the digestive system can absorb nutrients better. That's why you'll see many birds eating stones, eating grit off the roads. Pigeons in particular will often come down on roads and tracks, and they appear to be feeding there, but what they're doing is picking up little bits of grit to help them digest their food. Okay, so remember that there's a crop and a gizzard that helps digest food, and birds are capable of digesting some very extreme things. As you know, many birds eat meat, many birds eat vegetables, many birds eat insects or fruit, all of which sometimes are required to be processed, especially hard, tough foods. All right, and some birds eat very specialized diets, like the honey guide, which eats beeswax. And it has special bacteria that can help it extract the lipids from beeswax. Okay? So that's my basic overview of anatomy, of bird anatomy. Like I said, this is not comprehensive. The idea is simply to give you an introduction that you can then go on and read more about. And rather than getting hung up on terminology, get more interested in the concept. What is the bird using this anatomy for? What do pneumatization and bone fusion do that supports various skeletal functions? Okay? And with that, I'll end my lecture on anatomy, and we'll move on in the next class to a sort of similarly brief overview of the basic principles of bird physiology. Thank you.